This week in this subcommittee and on the House floor, House Republicans will continue our fight against Biden administration's disastrous policies that harm our nation's economy, national security, and energy dominance. The legislation under consideration today will put an end to the egregious and out-of-touch policies coming out of the White House that are hurting rural economies and ignoring the very people who live, work, and recreate on public land. Ultimately, we will hold this administration accountable and stand firm against their attempts to remove the public from public lands. There's an orchestrated attack on public lands by this administration. We and our constituents see the tools the administration is using, or better put, misusing, to carry out a misguided preservationist policy that is hurting Americans in forms of higher energy costs, less access to lands, and fewer jobs. The list of anti-energy policies advanced under this administration is simply staggering. Added to this is an attempted ban on oil and gas leasing, 3.5 million acres in new national monument designations, proposed conservation leases that would allow anyone, including hostile foreign nations, to lock up energy and mineral resources, and the recently proposed sage-grouse management plans. Of course, these all point back to President Biden's flawed and unscientific 30 by 30 agenda. This is bureaucracy doing what bureaucracy does, a small group of people in D.C. making decisions that affect places and people they refuse to visit and hear from. Today, we are addressing this mismanagement of federal lands and aiming to restore a balanced, thoughtful approach to land management through common sense legislation offered by 4 of my Republican colleagues. The first bill is H.R. 5499, Congressional Oversight of the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act is an outdated and obsolete law that allows presidents of both parties to ignore local communities and create confusion, uncertainty, and frustration around land use planning. Look at the case of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in Utah. Nearly 30 years ago, President Clinton designated this national monument during a ceremony he held out of state in Arizona and without consulting anyone in Utah. This national monument shut off mineral resources worth an estimated $330 billion, including 62 billion tons of coal and 270 million barrels of oil. Instead of becoming a booming hub for energy production, the state lost over 1,100 jobs. Decades later, county commissioners declared a state of emergency for public schools in the area due to low enrollment. The monument itself has fared no better, receiving limited federal funding and being subject to increased vandalism and resource destruction. Since taking office, only 3 years ago, President Biden has already designated 3.5 million acres of land as national monuments, including enlarging the footprint of Grand Staircase. Without further checks and balances, such as those offered by H.R. 5499, current and future presidents could lock up millions of additional acres with a stroke of a pen behind closed doors. Next, we will consider H.R. 7006, legislation from Representative Curtis that would prohibit natural asset companies from operating on Utah's public lands. After oversight and strong opposition spearheaded by this committee, the SEC withdrew the proposed natural asset companies rule earlier this year. However, given the obvious linkage between this rule and the BLM's so-called Landscape Health and Conservation Rule, there are still outstanding concerns that natural asset companies could reemerge, perhaps under a different name. Allowing natural asset companies to operate on public lands would prevent the land from being used to produce natural resources, including fossil fuels, mining, timber harvesting, and grazing. This could also open the door for a company controlled by a foreign adversary like China to hold rights to U.S. land and resources. This is also incompatible with statutory mandates for these lands, which direct them to be managed for multiple use and sustained yield for the benefit of the American people. Finally, we will consider 2 bills from Representatives Hageman and Boebert, H.R. 6085, H.R. 6547, that would nullify preservationist and resource management plans in their states that would restrict oil and gas development on a collective 3.4 million acres. A resource management plan should offer a balanced management plan for all multiple uses and interested stakeholders. However, these plans have been weaponized as a partisan tool to remove industries and uses that the administration does not like, in complete disregard of the facts, data, and science. I am deeply concerned that the written testimony we received in advance of today's hearing also shows the BLM is flagrantly disregarding their statutory mandate to coordinate with local government in developing these plans. For my constituents back home in Wisconsin who may be watching this, or any other member of the public who doesn't live out west, make no mistake, the legislation we are discussing today has a direct effect on you. If we end multiple use out west, that will disrupt our energy, food, and mineral supplies, which would drive up prices for everybody. One only needs to look at our allies in Europe to see what happens when we allow ourselves to become dependent on hostile foreign nations. American energy is inexpensive, reliable, clean, and abundant. That's why 1 year ago, House Republicans passed H.R. 1, the Lower Energy Costs Act, on the House floor. When we go back to the floor this week for Energy Week, we will once again be fighting for policies that lower prices at the pump and keep American energy dominant.